Overcoming language and culture barriers to improve trade abroad. The Business Language Show is in half an hour. First on BBC One, See Here.
The story of the
three little piggies. One, two, three.
It's Monday morning at the Castle Nursery School in Tamworth, Staffordshire, and a favourite moment for the children, story time.
Big, deep breath. And he huffed. And he puffed.
But 4-year-old Nicholas Carter isn't listening to the story, he's watching it. He was born deaf, and the only language he can understand is sign language.
Hello and welcome. You may remember that clip from the Tomorrow's World programme about little Nicholas Carter's cochlear implant operation. We interpreted it 6 weeks ago for See Here viewers. Cochlear implants are not new. In fact, the first experimental cochlear operation was carried out in 1957 in France, and the first operation was performed in this country by the late Graham Fraser in 1982. But extensive media coverage in recent months has brought the whole issue to the fore. Newspaper headlines claiming a miracle cure have angered some members of the deaf community who don't see deafness as an illness. Health professionals and deaf organisations have also criticised media reports for blurring the facts and generating a lot of confusion. With me in the studio are several people, all of whom have strong views on the subject. I'll be talking to them later. But first, I'd like to ask Elizabeth Edgeworth why she put forward a motion at last year's BDA conference to ban cochlear implants. Now, Elizabeth, at the conference you put forward this motion saying you wanted to ban cochlear implants, but what was the exact wording of the question?
Well, last year I put forward the motion, and what it said was I wanted children between the age of 3 to 12, I wanted cochlears banned for those.
So why do you want to do that for children that age?
Well, because if these children are born deaf or even deafened by that age, they've got culture, they've got language, deaf identity, emotions. If they have a cochlear, it's going to change all that.
Thank you. Well, we'll be discussing some of those issues in a moment. But first, let's take a look at what's involved in the operation.
Normally, sound comes into the external ear canal and is amplified in the middle ear. And the inner ear, which is this part here, or the cochlea, converts sound into electrical signals to be carried by the nerve of hearing to the brain.
It's this inner ear or cochlea that was damaged before Nicholas was born. A cochlear implant will take its place, processing sound electronically and sending it directly to the hearing nerve through 22 minute electrodes.
Now, at the time of the operation, we'll make a very small hole in the inner ear and insert all those 22 electrodes or wires right in the spiral of the inner ear itself. Now, this, of course, does not result in the restoration of normal hearing. It goes a long way towards that. It's important to realize that this is a very long-term project, and whereas the short-term results, there may be very little to see. What we're interested in is what Nicholas is going to be like 2 or 3 years after his operation.
Nicholas's operation will take 4 hours. The surgeon, Jerry O'Donoghue, will only implant half of the system, the radio receiver. The rest of the device, which picks up, processes and transmits the sound, is worn outside and will be given to Nicholas when he's recovered from surgery.
Now, I'm about to make a hole in the cochlea, the inner ear.
Jerry O'Donoghue's next delicate task will be to thread the minute bundle of 22 electrodes into Nicholas's cochlea. These will feed sound as electrical signals directly to the hearing nerve.
And it is going in very nicely.
The radio receiver is firmly attached to his skull, but before the wound is stitched up, the surgical team can actually test if the operation has been a success. The transmitter, which is normally worn on the outside, is placed against the receiver coil.
In the middle ear, we have a little muscle which is used to dampen sound. Now, this is the stapedius muscle just here. It's a very tiny muscle. It only measures 1 millimeter or 2 in diameter. Now, if our implant system is working, when we stimulate it to an uncomfortable level, that muscle should contract rather dramatically. Okay, let's go. Now, that's a massive response. You saw that?
With me now are Gerard O'Donoghue, the paediatric ear surgeon whom you've just seen in the film clip, Alison Heath, who had a cochlear implant 10 years ago, and Jack Ashley, whom you all know as one of our regular presenters, but who also had the operation last August. First, if I may come to you, Gerard. Now, we saw you doing the operation in that film clip. Do you think it's the same for children and adults, or is there a difference?
The proportions are a lot smaller. The technical procedure is rather much the same. The issues, of course, are a little different, but the operative procedure is rather much the same, apart from, as I say, some minor technical differences.
So what are these technical differences?
The size of the system is an awful lot smaller. One has, the head is a lot smaller, of course, and the mastoid bone is much smaller. The inner ear itself, or the cochlea, is full adult size at birth, and that is helpful, of course. Very often the children we're operating on have been deafened due to meningitis, and of course meningitis can damage the inner ear and prevent us putting in those 22 electrodes. So there are differences of that kind which are not insurmountable, but they are peculiar to children.
Now, you said that the devices are smaller, so when people grow and become adults, do you need to change the device, or do they keep the same one for life?
Yes, it may need to be changed. Head grows, obviously, as the child grows into adulthood. It hasn't happened yet, but it is a theoretical possibility that it will be needed, and we always tell parents about this in advance. But we do leave a certain redundancy in the system so that it can actually expand in response to head growth.
What are the advantages of cochlear implants? Are they better than hearing aids?
The advantages can be many. One has, for instance, with hearing aids, very often a problem of recruitment of loudness, where when the hearing aid is turned up to its full volume, it rings, and it can be very problematic. Whereas with a cochlear implant, it can be programmed for each individual. One also gets much more high-frequency information from implants than one does from a hearing aid, and these are particularly beneficial in understanding speech.
Now, Alison, you had your implant 10 years ago now. Do you feel that it's been a great help to you?
I feel it's helped me enormously. At first, it was quite difficult to learn to use it, but it improved rapidly at first, and then more slowly. But now I just can't be without it. It helps me lip reading. I can lip read much faster with the implant than without. And I also can understand a little speech without lip reading. For instance, if I'm looking down and somebody says, thank you or goodbye, I'm sorry, I should probably pick it up without lip reading. It makes life very much more restful.
So what actually happened? Did it improve your perception of sound? Can you enjoy hearing now?
World of sound is beautiful. When I go out into the garden in the morning, I can hear the birds twittering, I can hear the pigeons cooing, and a very noisy cock crowing next door. That's absolutely wonderful. And I can enjoy the ballet. I can honestly say I enjoy the music just as much as the dancing. I love it. It's absolutely wonderful.
I can now hear the human voice, although it's distorted, I can hear it. I can hear division bells in the House of Lords. I can hear the birds singing as Alison can. I can play with my grandchildren, hear their voices. In other words, this has transformed my life. And although that is not a miracle cure, to me, it is a miracle.
Now, Jack, what sort of sound do you hear? What is the sound like? Is it the same sort of sound that hearing people hear?
The key word is distorted. The human voice is distorted, but I've now had this implant, as you said, Clive, since last August. But in the last few weeks, I'm beginning to use the telephone after being totally deaf, for some 24 years. And the fact of being able to talk to my wife and my daughters and my family without any lip reading is quite indicative that I can follow human speech. And I regard that as a remarkable advance, and it is improving week by week. So I'm extremely optimistic about the future, even though I know of the reservations some people have about the implant, at any rate, for born deaf children.
When it's clear from Jack and Alison's experiences that their operations have been successful, now we want to look at another story that's been hailed as a success.
Right, well, Claire, we're here again with the video camera, as so often before.
It's 3 years since Beth Bearder had her implant. During that time, one of the Nottingham team, Dr. Margaret Tate, has been using video analysis to monitor Beth.
Video analysis is something that we do with children who have implants. If you think how long it takes a normally hearing baby to learn to talk, you're not expecting to see anything much in the way of words for the whole of the first year, and probably longer than that. So we're looking for indications that this vocal ability is developing and that there is progress going on.
Oh, right, there's no handle. Yes, it's rubbish, isn't it? Go
With the
away.
video that we made of Beth prior to implant, her communication was quite skilled communication, but it was silent. 3 months on from the implant, there are vocalizations.
And the cow says, moo, moo, moo.
By 12 months, we see further changes in Beth. She's now using words, and she's putting words together. So on one occasion, she says, "Long way, Kirsty House."
Get there.
Oh, my feet down.
Long way to go.
Her speech is very, very deaf speech, but it is real spoken language.
Came out of the house.
We're now nearly 3.5 years on since Beth got to her speech processor, and there have been big changes over the last year.
The mess was clean
And neat and tidy.
and neat and tidy.
Her speech is now pretty well what one would expect for a little girl of that age. She doesn't need to lip read anymore. You can see that she's enjoying what she's listening to, and she's appreciating the feeling in it, and that shows in her voice. And they laughed.
And they laughed.
That's the end.
Here to discuss the issues are Harlan Lane, speech scientist and psychologist from Northeastern University, USA, Paul Redfern, consultant and writer on deaf issues, and Carlo Lorenzi from the National Deaf Children's Society. Paul, if I can come to you first. Now, what we've just seen in the film, the little girl Beth, do you think that her story is a success story? Well, if you measure success by hearing, then yes. But what about success in human terms? That's a different issue altogether. Hearing is just a small part of, and speech are just small parts of being a human being. When I left school, I was called an oral success because I could lip read well and I could speak fairly well. But in other ways, I found it very difficult to cope in a hearing world. And for me, success means complete integration as a human being, as a person. I respect Jack and Alison, people with a hearing loss, deafened people. Jack can describe himself as deaf, and I can say, I'm sorry, but I don't agree with him, because he's not deaf. He's a person with a hearing loss, and there's a big difference between those two things. When I talk about deaf people, I'm talking in cultural terms. And if a person who is deaf maybe gets some hearing, they won't be successful as a person, because what they hear might damage their own view of themselves and their own self-esteem, and that's a big concern for me. Gerard, I'd like to ask you something. Now, in the past, when people have done cochlear implants, they did say that they wouldn't do them on congenitally profoundly deaf children, that would not happen. And now we seem to have had a shift in policy over the last few years. They've started doing such operations on born deaf children. Why is this?
Well, I think that the benefits that have accrued to adults from implantation has been so great and has so impressed all of us in the clinical world that we felt it unconscionable to deny young children the same benefit. And if adults could regain their hearing from implants, well, surely the same should be true for children. Now, the issue is, of course, a lot more complex, and I don't deny that, but the benefits that are coming out from implants in studies, not only in this country, in North America and elsewhere, are very encouraging indeed, so that we feel justified continuing to implant very young deaf children.
Elizabeth believes that cochlear implants shouldn't be given to children until they're over 12 years old. Do you think that's a good enough age to start?
Oh no, I fully respect her view. She's entitled to her view. It's not my view. I look on deafness as somewhat of a medical issue. It's very important that the implantation is carried on early, because the brain stops responding to stimulation relatively early, and we know that in terms of a lot of experimental evidence that's done with the visual system, as well as experimental evidence on the auditory system, that if it's not stimulated early, and by early we mean probably in the first 5 years or so, then it's very hard to make sense of the signals that are passed in by means of an implant. So that the hearing restoration that takes place by means of an implant has got to be undertaken early in a child's life. Doing it late on in life, I think, is a missed opportunity.
Now, where is a child's right of choice in all this? I mean, you're saying we are always deciding on behalf of the child whether to operate or what. Where are the child's rights being protected? Harlan, any comments on that?
In our society, we trust the parents to act in the child's interest until the child is old enough to be a competent judge of what's in his or her interest. And that makes sense to me. I mean, parents are going to, they love the child, they couldn't be more motivated to do the right thing, and they're going to live with the consequences. So I think those are the right people to turn to. But as always, parents can't make good decisions unless they're informed. And what they need more than anything else, in my opinion, is to know deaf adults and see how deaf adults raise their deaf children, and also how they raise their hearing children. I think then they would be fully informed and would be able to make better choices.
Now, what about deaf parents who have a deaf child and decide we want our child to have a cochlear implant when they're very young?
I don't know if there's ever been such a case. I would say those are deaf parents who sadly did not fully appreciate the extent to which they have a magnificent culture, a sensory experience which is as beautiful as the birds in the garden, but which is a visual one, a language which is the equal of English, a very proud minority heritage. So if those parents missed out on all of that, that's tragic. I'd be very sorry to see them pass on that oppression to their child.
I'd like to respond to Harlan's point that he's not aware of any cases where deaf parents of deaf children have considered an implant. I think the issues facing deaf parents of deaf children are perhaps more complex than those facing hearing children. However, I've been contacted by 4 sets of deaf parents who could said to be from the core deaf community. In other words, deaf parents using essentially BSL being part of their local deaf community. And it seems to me that they have the same rights as hearing parents to choose an implant for their child. What my principal concern has been, linked both to deaf parents as well as to hearing parents, is that many of them come to the National Deaf Children's Society with a background of misinformation, and therefore they have very false expectations. And I think that the degree of false expectations amongst the deaf community are probably higher due to the misinformation.
Okay, now I've got 4 children. I'm a deaf parent too. 2 of my children are deaf, one of them being profoundly deaf and the other one partially deaf. But the 4 of them have been brought up using BSL language. They know about the deaf culture. There's no way I would even contemplate a cochlear for any of them.
Well, I think the issue is not just hearing. It's also civil rights involved here. I mean, if people feel that they can get access to television and different areas, then I wouldn't object to the technology for that. I mean, I use minicoms and fax machines and so on, and I welcome technology in that respect. But I do feel that we need access. We also need our rights in law so that we can, you know, take on employers who won't give us jobs and so on. And we need success in these areas in lots of ways. And improving hearing isn't necessarily important, because we can compete with people on equal terms, even though we're deaf. But one important point, a lot of deaf children are brought up trying to be hearing, trying to make them hearing, and that is a problem for them in lots of ways. And what's important is we have to respect the children, whether they're hearing or deaf. If they're hearing, then they should feel it's okay to be hearing, and some hearing children may well benefit from cochlear implants, but other children from hearing families, other children, I don't know. How do you make the decisions? What do you base them on? So how do you judge whether a child is a suitable candidate for a cochlear implant? I mean, what are the criteria that you use? What do you have to match up? What are they?
This is a very important issue. First of all, it has to be done on a very multidisciplinary basis. A lot of specialists are involved, and it's important that the child goes to a center that has a lot of experience in managing profoundly deaf children. And fortunately, there are a number of such centers in the country, and the National Deaf Children have set up a list, as it were, of centres where this kind of evaluation can take place. And we have in our program in Nottingham very experienced pediatric audiologists, speech and language therapists, educational psychologists, and a whole array of professionals who are intimately involved in this area and to understand the problems of profoundly deaf children very well.
Alan Lane.
Various medical and other groups in the United States have characterized the implanted deaf child as a severely hearing impaired child. So we have to understand that in the present state of the technology, as I read the research and read the recommendations of these bodies, the parent's choice is to make their child severely hearing impaired or to leave the child deaf. Now, we know that severely hearing impaired children become deaf adults. They marry deaf and they enter the deaf community. So we have to keep that in perspective here. I would say to the mother, your child will be, in all likelihood, a deaf adult. What should you do now to be sure that he or she is a healthy, linguistically sophisticated, professionally successful deaf adult?
I would like to return to the point about success. Paul has said that we need to broaden our definition of how we measure the success of cochlear implantation, and I'm entirely in agreement with that. I think, for example, to only measure success in a child's ability to discriminate speech in certain restricted forms is only one measure. I also think that to measure cochlear implantation in terms of a failure of a child deciding not to wear the implant is also erroneous, because I think the important thing that we're giving to that child and that family is a dimension of choice. And if that child then chooses not to wear the implant as a teenager, I think that's a perfectly valid choice, in the same way as a number of deaf adults currently choose not to wear their hearing aid. We've increased that person's capacity for choice, and I think it's an important point for us to bear in mind.
Well, 2 points I'd like to make. I have to disagree with Carlo when he says that people have freedom of choice. With a hearing aid, if you're tired of using it, you can take it off. With a cochlear implant, you can't take it out because it's implanted permanently. And if you want it out properly, you have to have another operation to have it removed. So I don't think freedom of choice is quite the word there. But also, most important, in the child's life are the parents. And all of the implant teams say that they say it's very important, that the parents know what's happening. And if this is so important, the support is so important, long-term support, why are we not providing enough money for this long-term support? Why are we spending the money on operations? Really, we should be supporting the parents all of the time. And I feel that perhaps we are going down a dangerous road here, concentrating on the medical responses and the medical aspects all of the time, when what we need is to improve the human response and the human part of things.
It all hinges on understanding that the deaf community is a linguistic and cultural minority. If you don't see that, then we should implant all the children. If you do see that, it's a problem.
Jack, any response?
Well, Harden Lane and his colleagues have put forward some understandable objections, but the bottom line is that cochlear implants are a wonderful invention, and all those people who want them and can benefit from them should have them, and nobody should try to force their views on anybody else. It's a matter of free choice.
Okay, I've listened to everything that's gone on, and I think the deaf community is in danger of diminishing in the future. I'm concerned about deaf children having cochlear implants and going into the hearing world. They will do, it's inevitable. They will stop signing because hearing children will obviously skip them for signing. That happens now, and I'm concerned about that. And I still feel strongly that deaf children should not have cochlear implants.
Thank you, Elizabeth, and thank you everyone for coming along and joining in this discussion today. Well, I think it's clear from today's discussion that cochlear implants have obvious advantages for deafened adults. The implantation of young children is more controversial. Deaf and hearing people need to be fully aware of the facts to enable them to make an informed decision. Deaf people need to know what the scientific and medical implications will be for the deaf community. And hearing parents need to know more about the culture of deafness before they decide whether to go ahead with this operation. Unfortunately, we've only been able to touch on some of these issues. But we hope the discussion has cleared up some of the confusion. If you'd like more information, which is free and comes in a variety of different languages, the National Deaf Children's Society has a large number of leaflets and booklets available. And the address is coming up very shortly. See you next week. Bye-bye.